The rain came down in heavy sheets, hammering against the windshield of Ben Harper's bus, as if it wanted to wash the entire city clean. Water gushed along the gutters, splashing over curbs and soaking anyone unfortunate enough to be out in the downpour. The city lights blurred through the torrent, casting fragmented reflections across the wet streets. Ben adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his fingers stiff and cold. He'd driven this route for years, but the storm's ferocity tonight demanded his full concentration. Only 2 stops remained before his shift ended. The thought of trading the icy, damp air for the warmth of home, a modest apartment he shared with his 16-year-old daughter, Chloe, brought a weary smile to his face. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He just had to finish this route. The bus jolted over a pothole, and Ben scanned the dimly lit street ahead. No passengers in sight. He released a breath, hoping the rest of the night would be uneventful. But as he pulled up to the third-to-last stop, a figure emerged from the darkness, hunched and shivering beneath a battered gray coat. The street lamp's dim glow revealed a man who looked as though he had stepped out of another time, weary and out of place in the bustle of the modern city. Ben opened the door, and the cold wind rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and desperation. The man stepped forward hesitantly, his thin frame trembling. Water dripped from the brim of his hat, tracing lines down his worn, pale face. He climbed the steps with effort, pausing to catch his breath. Ben's practiced eyes took in the details: the threadbare coat, the scuffed shoes that barely held together, and the way the man's shoulders curled inward, as if trying to protect what little dignity he had left. "Evening," Ben said, his voice calm and welcoming despite the late hour and storm. He had a way of making people feel seen, no matter how hurried or tired he was. The man nodded but didn't meet his eyes. He reached into his pocket, fingers shaking as he searched for coins. Ben watched as the man's hands fumbled, and a few coins slipped free, bouncing across the metal floor with a sharp, echoing sound. The man knelt awkwardly, his movements slow and pained, chasing after the scattered change. "It's all right," Ben said quickly, his voice gentle. He leaned over and picked up a coin, pressing it into the fare slot without hesitation. "It's covered." The man froze for a moment, his head bowed. When he finally looked up, there was a flash of something raw and fragile in his eyes, pride bruised by circumstance, gratitude that he couldn't quite bring himself to express. I can pay," he stammered, but his voice trailed off, brittle and unsure. "I know," Ben said, offering a reassuring nod. "But tonight you don't have to." The man stood, shoulders slightly more relaxed, and moved slowly toward a seat near the front. His wet clothes clung to him, and he sank down heavily, as if the weight of the world had finally caught up. Ben glanced back at him in the rearview mirror, noting the man's faraway gaze and hollow cheeks. Something about him tugged at Ben's chest, an ache born of recognition. He had seen too many people like this lately, forgotten by the world, pushed aside when they were no longer deemed useful. As the bus rumbled back into motion, the sound of rain on metal filled the silence. Ben focused on the road, but his thoughts lingered on the man, whose tired eyes now stared out at the rain-slicked streets. For a few minutes, they traveled this way, 2 strangers bound by the same path but living vastly different lives. "Thank you," the man said suddenly, breaking the quiet. His voice was low, rough with exhaustion but laced with sincerity. I don't usually ask for help. It's been hard lately." Ben nodded without turning, knowing better than to press. "Happens to the best of us," he said lightly, hoping to offer comfort without prying. "You just rest. Long day." "Long life," the man murmured, a bitter edge creeping into his tone. He paused, as if weighing whether to say more. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Ben recognized the regret in those words, the way they hung heavy in the air. He knew that kind of pain, life taking unexpected turns, dreams slipping away in the wake of too many hardships. "I'm Ben," he said after a moment, hoping to shift the weight between them. "What's your name?" "Arthur," the man replied, a small, tired smile tugging at his lips. "Arthur Willis." "Nice to meet you, Arthur," Ben said, genuine warmth in his voice. This city can be tough, but you'll make it through. We all do. Arthur didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his words were laced with melancholy. I had a son once, he said, his gaze fixed on the blurred lights outside. We don't talk anymore. Haven't for a long time. He made something of himself. Big name, big money. But life has a way of slipping through your fingers, doesn't it? Ben's chest tightened at the vulnerability in Arthur's voice. Family could be complicated, he knew that all too well. He thought of Chloe and how hard he worked to give her the life she deserved. It's never too late, he offered gently. People change. Relationships change. Arthur's eyes flickered, as if the hope Ben offered was something too fragile to hold. Maybe, he said, but his voice was hollow. They fell into silence again. When the bus approached Arthur's stop, Ben slowed to a halt, watching as the man struggled to his feet. This is you, Ben said, trying to infuse his words with encouragement. Arthur hesitated, then nodded. Thank you, he said again, his voice steadier now. You didn't have to. I know, Ben replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. Take care, Arthur. Arthur stepped off the bus and into the rain. Ben watched as he moved slowly down the street, shoulders hunched against the cold. He felt a pang of worry, a sense that Arthur's story was far from over, and that it might intersect with his own again. As he pulled the bus back into motion, Ben tried to shake the feeling. He told himself it was just another passenger, another day. But deep down he knew better. Sometimes, fate had a way of tying people together, even when they didn't yet understand why. Over the next week, Ben couldn't shake the memory of Arthur. He had grown used to seeing people come and go on his route, many leaving only fleeting impressions. But something about the old man lingered, the haunted look in his eyes, the way his voice trembled when he spoke of his estranged son. Ben had seen hardship etched into the faces of his passengers before, but Arthur's story touched a nerve. He tried to push it from his mind. He had more immediate concerns to address. Rent was due in a couple of weeks, and his daughter, Chloe, needed art supplies for a school project that could boost her chances of getting into art school. Ben had been saving every spare dollar, stretching himself thin to make sure Chloe had a shot at her dreams. She was talented and driven, and he'd do whatever it took to support her. But even in the midst of his own worries, Ben found himself scanning the stops along his route, hoping to see Arthur again. When days turned into a week with no sign of the old man, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, on a chilly Friday evening, Ben's silent hope was realized. The sun had set early, and the air was sharp with the biting chill of winter's approach. As Ben pulled up to one of the stops near the edge of the city, he saw Arthur standing there. This time, the old man was wrapped tightly in his battered gray coat, but he didn't seem as hunched as before. When Ben opened the door, Arthur stepped inside, shaking off the cold. Evening, Arthur, Ben said, feeling a surge of relief. There was warmth in his voice that surprised even him. Arthur blinked, as if surprised that he was remembered. A thin, tired smile flickered across his face. You remember me? Of course, Ben replied. He waited until Arthur had settled into his usual spot near the front before starting back on the route. How have you been? Arthur shrugged, a gesture of resignation. Still here. That counts for something, doesn't it? Ben nodded. It does. He kept his eyes on the road but listened carefully. You staying warm? Arthur hesitated, then gave a small nod. As best as I can, he said, his voice rough. After a pause, he added, I found a place. Not much, but it's dry. That's good, Ben said, genuinely relieved. Really good. They fell into a companionable silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the bus engine and the occasional splash of water as they passed over rain-slicked streets. Arthur stared out the window, his eyes distant. Ben let him have his thoughts, sensing that the old man needed time to gather himself. When they were about halfway through the route, Arthur spoke again, his voice softer this time. You have family, Ben. The question caught Ben off guard. He wasn't used to sharing much about himself with passengers, but something in Arthur's tone, a mixture of curiosity and genuine need for connection, made it impossible to deflect. I have a daughter, Ben said, a touch of pride coloring his words. Chloe, she's 16. Loves to paint. Wants to go to art school. Arthur's eyes brightened slightly. Art school. That's wonderful. Yeah, Ben agreed. He couldn't help but smile. It's her dream. Dreams are important, Arthur murmured, a wistful note in his voice. They keep us going. He fell silent again, his expression tinged with regret. I had dreams once. Ben glanced at him, sensing there was more. What did you do? I worked with wood, Arthur said slowly, as if sifting through memories. Furniture, toys, anything people needed. I loved it. There was something about taking a rough block of wood and shaping it into something beautiful. Something lasting. That's amazing, Ben said, and he meant it. There was a deep, old-world respect in his voice. You must have made some incredible things. Arthur smiled faintly, but it quickly faded. I tried. But times changed. People wanted cheap, fast, disposable. I couldn't keep up. Ben nodded, understanding all too well how quickly the world could leave someone behind. It's a shame, he said quietly. We need more things that last. Arthur didn't respond right away. He reached into the pocket of his coat and, with trembling hands, pulled out a small wooden carving, a bird with wings outstretched, intricately detailed and polished despite its simple appearance. He held it out to Ben. I made this a long time ago, he said, his voice low. For my son, when he was a boy. Ben accepted the carving with gentle hands, feeling the smooth curves beneath his fingers. It was beautiful evidence of skill and love. It's incredible, he said, genuinely moved. Thank you. Arthur nodded, his expression both grateful and pained. It's just wood, he said quietly. But it means something. It's not just wood, Ben replied, tucking the carving carefully into his coat pocket. I'll keep it safe. When Arthur reached his stop, he stood slowly, his movements stiff and hesitant. Thank you, Ben, he said, his voice steadier. For everything. Anytime, Ben said. Take care, Arthur. As Arthur stepped off the bus and disappeared into the night, Ben watched him go, a knot forming in his chest. The carving felt heavy in his pocket, a reminder of everything Arthur had lost and what little he still clung to. Ben couldn't fix the past, but he hoped that his small acts of kindness could at least make the present a little brighter. Days passed, and Arthur became a regular presence on Ben's route. Each time they met, they spoke a little more, slowly piecing together fragments of each other's stories. Ben learned that Arthur's son, Nathaniel, had become a wealthy businessman, successful and influential, but estranged from his father. The pain of that separation was evident in every word Arthur spoke, a mix of pride and lingering heartache. Meanwhile, Ben continued to wrestle with his own challenges. Chloe's art school ambitions weighed heavily on him. Every spare dollar went toward supporting her dreams, even as bills piled up. But as hard as things were, he never stopped looking for Arthur, hoping to see the old man safe and sound. One evening, Arthur didn't appear at his usual stop. The absence gnawed at Ben, filling him with a sense of foreboding. When days turned into a week with no sign of Arthur, Ben decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. On his day off, he went searching for his friend. Walking through the neighborhood where Arthur usually disembarked, Ben knocked on doors, spoke to shopkeepers, and described Arthur to anyone who would listen. It was a young woman at a corner store who finally gave him a lead. The old man with the wooden carving, she asked. I think he lived 2 streets over. Haven't seen him in a while. Ben followed her directions to a rundown apartment building. He climbed creaking steps and knocked on doors until someone finally spoke. You're looking for Arthur, a neighbor said, his voice low. They took him to the hospital. He wasn't doing well. Ben's heart sank. He rushed to the hospital, dread tightening in his chest. When he found Arthur, the old man was lying in a stark, sterile room, tubes and monitors surrounding him. He looked small, pale and fragile against the white sheets. "You didn't have to come," Arthur rasped when he saw Ben. "Of course I did," Ben said, moving closer. "I'm your friend." Arthur's eyes glistened with tears. "You have your own life." "I'm right where I need to be," Ben replied softly. In the days that followed, Ben became a fixture at Arthur's bedside. Each morning he drove his bus route, offering kind words and familiar smiles to passengers, but his thoughts rarely strayed far from the old man. Every evening, Ben would head to the hospital, bringing small comforts: a warm blanket, books of poetry, or a bag of Arthur's favorite mint candies he managed to find at a corner store. Sometimes they talked, other times they sat in companionable silence, their presence alone saying more than words ever could. Arthur's health wavered between good and bad days. On good days, his eyes sparkled faintly as he spoke of his son, Nathaniel. There was pride there, but always tinged with regret. "He's done well for himself," Arthur said one evening, his gaze fixed on a spot somewhere beyond the hospital window. "Always smart. Ambitious. But I pushed too hard. Wanted more for him than I could give." He paused, his expression pained. "I wasn't enough." Ben listened quietly, his own thoughts turning to Chloe. The fear of not being enough, of falling short as a parent, was one he understood all too well. "You loved him," Ben said gently. "That matters. More than anything." Arthur nodded, though tears glistened in his eyes. "I hope so," he whispered. One day, as Ben arrived at the hospital, he noticed Arthur was more withdrawn than usual, his face pale and his breathing labored. He pulled up a chair and leaned close. "Arthur, what's going on?" "They called him," Arthur rasped, his voice trembling with both hope and fear. "Nathaniel. I didn't think they'd reach him. But they did." "That's good," Ben said carefully, though he sensed Arthur's apprehension. "Maybe he'll come." Arthur shook his head weakly. "It's been too long. He has his own life. I don't even know if he'll come." His voice broke on the last word. "He might surprise you," Ben offered, but he understood the deep, unspoken pain of Arthur's doubt. Reaching out to an estranged loved one was like touching a wound that never fully healed. The next few days passed in a blur of anxious waiting. Arthur grew weaker, his frail body fighting a losing battle. Ben stayed by his side, bringing warmth, quiet reassurances, and the gift of simply being present. On the morning of the fourth day, Ben walked into Arthur's room and found an unfamiliar man sitting by the bed, a tall figure in a sharply tailored suit, his posture tense and his expression unreadable. Ben's breath caught. This had to be Nathaniel. Arthur's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, father and son simply stared at each other. Time stretched, thick with years of unspoken words and missed moments. Finally, Arthur spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Nathaniel." "None." "Dad," Nathaniel replied, his voice strained. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together as if to anchor himself. "I came as soon as I could." Relief, pain, and longing washed over Arthur's face, each emotion sharper than the last. I didn't think you would." "I didn't know," Nathaniel said, his tone cracking. "I didn't know you were like this." Arthur closed his eyes, as if the weight of the words was too much to bear. "You didn't want to know." Outside the room, Ben lingered in the hallway, giving them space but hearing every word. He thought of all the stories Arthur had shared, the love, the mistakes, the pride and regret that had defined his relationship with his son. Now, watching the reunion unfold, Ben felt the gravity of their bond, fractured but not yet beyond repair. Inside the room, the conversation between Arthur and Nathaniel was raw and tangled. There were no easy words, only the halting confessions of two people who had been hurt by time and circumstance. Nathaniel spoke of his life, the empire he had built, the sacrifices he had made. Arthur spoke of the dreams he had nurtured and the crushing disappointment of being left behind. There was blame, regret, and a desperate hope to reclaim what had been lost. When Nathaniel stepped out of the room, his face pale and drawn, he spotted Ben. "You're the bus driver?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and defensiveness. "Ben Harper," Ben said, extending a hand. "I've been helping your father." Nathaniel stared at the offered hand before shaking it, his grip firm but his eyes wary. "Why?" he asked. "You don't even know him." Ben met Nathaniel's gaze steadily. "Because he needed help," he said simply. "That's all." Nathaniel's eyes flickered with something confusion, perhaps, or disbelief. "People don't just do that," he said, his voice quiet. "Maybe they should," Ben replied, his tone gentle but firm. "We all need someone sometimes." For a long moment, Nathaniel said nothing. When he finally nodded and turned away, Ben hoped it wasn't the end of their story. In the days that followed, Nathaniel's visits became more frequent. He brought flowers, spoke with the doctors, and arranged for a private nurse. Yet his presence was tentative, as if he were afraid to let his guard down. Arthur, for his part, seemed torn between gratitude and the scars of old wounds that had never healed. Ben continued to visit, often serving as a silent witness to their strained attempts at reconnection. He tried to encourage Arthur to speak and gently nudged Nathaniel to listen. There were moments when it seemed they might bridge the gap, a shared memory. A fleeting smile, but old pain had a way of resurfacing. One evening, as Ben sat at Arthur's bedside, Nathaniel arrived unexpectedly. He looked exhausted, as if burdened by the weight of everything left unsaid. He pulled up a chair, and for a while, they all sat in silence. Eventually, Nathaniel spoke, his voice raw and trembling. "I'm sorry," he said, the words hanging in the air. "For everything." Arthur's eyes filled with tears. "I missed you," he whispered. Every day. Father and son reached for each other's hands. It was not a perfect reconciliation. Years of pain could not be undone with a few words. But it was a beginning. Ben quietly stepped out of the room, his heart heavy and hopeful all at once. He had only wanted to help, but he had become part of a journey that was far greater, a journey of forgiveness, love, and the courage to face the past. He didn't know what lay ahead for Arthur and Nathaniel, but he hoped it would lead to healing. The opening of the Arthur Willis Center for Community Renewal was a testament to the legacy of one man's life, a life marked by hardship, quiet dignity, and the power of connection. People from all walks of life gathered to celebrate, filling the space with warmth, laughter, and hope. Chloe's mural, a vibrant depiction of resilience and compassion, adorned the main wall, telling a story of second chances and kindness rippling outward. Ben stood quietly by the mural, watching the energy around him. The center had become more than he ever imagined, a place where people like Arthur could find shelter, community, and the chance to rebuild. And at its heart was the memory of a man who had once stepped onto Ben's bus on a rainy night, carrying only a battered coat and a weary soul. As the crowd began to thin, Nathaniel approached Ben, his hands in his pockets and a contemplative expression on his face. The suit he wore was sharp and tailored, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He gestured for Ben to step outside, away from the noise and bustle. The evening air was cool, and stars blinked down from a clear sky. Nathaniel leaned against the railing, silent for a moment. "You know," he began, his voice low, "I've been thinking about everything. About my father, this place, and you." Ben looked at him, unsure where the conversation was headed. "What about me?" Nathaniel took a breath. "My father didn't have much in the end. But he had you." He paused, as if weighing his next words. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for what you did, for being there when I wasn't." Ben shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Nathaniel. I just did what felt right." "I know," Nathaniel said softly. "That's exactly why I'm here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, pressing it into Ben's hands. "Please take this, for everything you did for him. And for you and Chloe." Confused, Ben opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $10,000. His eyes widened, and for a moment he was too stunned to speak. I can't. Nathaniel, this is too much. It's not nearly enough, Nathaniel replied, his voice firm but kind. I've spent my whole life chasing success, thinking it was measured in numbers and deals, but seeing what you did for my father and what you built here, it made me realize that real success is about giving back. He met Ben's gaze, sincerity shining in his eyes. This money is for Chloe, so you don't have to worry about her future, so you can focus on what really matters. Tears stung Ben's eyes and he swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the check in his hand. You don't know what this means, he whispered. Chloe, she can go to art school now. I don't have to keep wondering if I'll have enough. Nathaniel nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Then it's worth it. Emotion swelled in Ben's chest, and he extended his hand. But Nathaniel pulled him into a hug instead, an embrace that spoke of gratitude, forgiveness, and the bond they had built. When they pulled apart, both men stood in silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. Thank you, Ben, Nathaniel said, his voice steady. For everything. No, Ben replied, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. They stood together for a while longer, watching as people continued to come and go from the center, a place built on the foundation of kindness and second chances. As Ben walked home that night, the check still clutched in his hand, he thought of Chloe's future, of Arthur's memory, and of the ripple effect of one simple act of compassion. The next morning, Ben drove his usual route with a lighter heart. As he pulled up to a stop, he saw a young man standing alone, shivering in the early morning chill. Ben opened the door, offering a warm smile. You need a ride, he asked. The young man stepped inside, and so the cycle continued, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could change lives, one person at a time.